Welcome to the Darrell McClain Show. I'm your host, Darrell McClain, and let's get into our episode.
Intelligentsia, the endonym of sarcasm, the nutty professor, to your whack-ass marmalade. It's T-Bone from T-Bone and Chick Brew in the morning. Now available in podcast format. Simply search for the T-Bone and Chick Brew podcast, available wherever fine podcasts are sold.
The Darrell McClain Show is fully listener-supported, independent media that won't lead you to tribalism. You can get a membership for as little as $3 a month at www.patreon.com/The Darrell McClain Show. We talk about a lot of serious topics on this show. One very serious topic is women's health. One company that stood out to me was vslay.com because the owner is very transparent about her own struggles in the women's health department and has great customer service, great deals, and frequent sales. You can check her out, her great customer service, products about women's health, and frequent sales at www.vslay.com. That is www.vslay.com. The South Carolina Supreme Court struck down the state's ban on abortion after 6 weeks. The ruling stated that the law violated the constitutional rights to privacy that extended to a decision whether to terminate a pregnancy. Now, the court ruled in a 3-2 decision to strike down the Fetal Heartbeat and Protection from Abortion Act, which the overturning of the law, abortions in South Carolina will be permitted up until 20 weeks of gestation. The bill was signed into law February of 2021, but did not go into effect until shortly after the U.S. Supreme Court overturned the landmark Roe v. Wade decision last summer. Under the law, abortions were banned when a fetal heartbeat was detectable, which usually occurs around 6 weeks. South Carolina Supreme Court Justice Kay Harn noted that before many people know they are pregnant. In her opinion, Hearn rejected the argument put forth by the South Carolina state government that the constitutional rights to privacy were limited by the absence of the language mentioning bodily autonomy and medical care, an argument that the states with similar laws have previously made. Quote, "We hold that our state constitutional right to privacy extends to a woman's decision to have an abortion. The state unquestionably has the authority to limit the right of privacy that protects women from that state interference with her decision. But any such limitation must be responsible and must be reasonable and must be meaningful in that the time frames imposed must afford a woman sufficient time to determine she is pregnant and take the responsible steps to terminate that pregnancy," Hearn concluded. South Carolina Supreme Court Justice Donald Betty and Justice John Cannon Few concurred with Hearn's opinion. Justice George James Jr. and John Ketterbridge dissented. In a statement provided to The Hill, the Speaker of the South Carolina House of Representatives, Rep. Merle Smith, said the court had created a constitutional right to an abortion where none existed. Today's decision fails to represent the concept of separation of powers and strips the people of the state from having a say in a decision that was meant to reflect their voices. Instead, South Carolina is left with a decision that is not reflective of our state's political process or will, Smith said. reproductive rights activists applauded the decision on Thursday, with Nancy Northup, the president and CEO of the Center of Reproductive Rights, calling it a rejection of an insidious attempt to take away South Carolina's fundamental rights under the state's constitution. These radical bans have wreaked havoc across the South and Midwest, but today's decision means that the right to make the deeply personal health care decisions will remain protected in South Carolina, an immense victory for South Carolinians and an entire region, Northam said. So, the battle about abortions is not over yet, and the limitations is not over yet. It is going back to the states, and now we are going to continue to have these types of decisions, and I'm going to continue to report them on them. I think I won't go out of my I won't be out of line, I should say, when I say that what I said before. We still have the same rhetoric, and I still have the same response. You can say that 6 weeks is way too early for somebody to know if they were going to be pregnant. And I say, the second you engage in sex, you know that there is a risk of you getting pregnant. So we like I said in a previous episode, we like to talk about choice, etc. You did freely choose to engage in sexual activity, and that is just where I'll leave that conversation. But I think I have said before, if not, I'll say it again. This is not going to be solved in the realm of the political sphere. This is not a political issue, because politics, by its very nature, comes with certain compromises. You are going to have to knock out this issue on life and where life begins, and et cetera, et cetera. You're going to have to deal with this in a spiritual manner. And so I know there was a great celebration when this decision came out, but I knew that it was going to be temporary. Anyway, let me stick to this topic for a bit. The CVS, Walgreens seek to dispense abortion pills. Two of the largest, biggest pharmacy chains in the country are planning to seek certification needed to dispense abortion pills in states where it's illegal, according to a spokesperson for the companies. The decision by Walgreens and CVS are likely to provide a boost in the new Food and Drug Administration policy announced that will allow retail pharmacies to dispense the mifepristone from a certified prescriber if they meet certain criteria. Quote, we are working through the registration necessary training of our pharmacists, as well as evaluating our pharmacy network in terms of where we normally dispense products that have extra FDA requirements, and will dispense these consistent with federal and state laws. Now that is from Fraser Ingerman, a spokesperson for Walgreens. A spokesperson for CVS said the company also plans to seek certification where legally permissible. Pharmacies in the states with near total abortion bans would not be eligible. Some states also mandate that pills must be dispensed in person by a physician who prescribes them. Now, until 2021, mifepristone could only be dispensed in person by a physician. The FDA temporarily lifted that requirement because of COVID-19 pandemic, and the Biden administration made a change to a permanent in December of 2021, paving the way for doctors to prescribe the drug digitally and then mail the pills to patients. So, yeah. And I think I said this before, that the former President Trump's remarks about abortion was a bit troubling, but Trump abortion remarks spelled actually political peril for the GOP. The former President Trump's criticism of a hardline abortion opponents is laying bare the tension over the issue within the GOP as the party looks to regroup after bruising midterm elections. Trump accused Republicans, particularly those against abortions with no exceptions, of underperforming in the election. It wasn't my fault that the Republicans didn't live up to expectations, Trump wrote on his social media platform, Truth Social. I was 233 through 20. It was the abortion issue, poorly handled by many Republicans, especially those that firmly insisted on no exceptions, even in the case of rape, incest, or life of the mother, that lost large numbers of voters, end quote. Anti-abortion pushback. The attack drew a response from the anti-abortion group Susan B. Anthony, Pro-Life America, which was amplified by Trump's former Vice President Mike Pence, underscoring the divide within the party over how to message on the issue. Terry Schilling, the president of the Conservative American Principles Project, lambasted Trump's statement as stupid in her interview with The Hill. Ultimately, I thought it was so unlike Trump, Schilling said. First of all, it's not true. Candidates that endorsed that lost all went into this strategy of deflecting and the ostrich method. Now, at the root of the back and forth is the fact that Democrats have successfully used the abortion issue as a galvanizing force in the wake of the overturning of Roe v. Wade last summer. The problem is either when candidates stick their head in the sand and don't know how to deal with it or don't want to talk about it, one Republican strategist said. Conservatives, one point to a number of the Senate candidates in tough races such as Mehmet Oz, who lost to the now Senator John Fetterman in Pennsylvania in November. All throughout the campaign, Fetterman is accusing Dr. Oz of being an extreme on abortion, Schilling said, and Dr. Oz's strategy, and this is not just him, it was for most of the candidates that lost, his strategy was to deflect and not to address the claim and then immediately shift it over to inflation. That is a losing strategy. There were other Trump-endorsed candidates that learned and to what to do, and they leaned in on abortion restrictions and ended up losing their races, including former Georgia candidate, Senate candidate Herschel Walker, who said he opposed exceptions. Additionally, former Pennsylvania gubernatorial candidate Doug Mastriano and Michigan gubernatorial candidate Tudor Dixon voiced opposition to exceptions, and they lost their races as well. Now, of course, there are also other factors as to why these candidates lost. Whether abortion was the main reason or whether it was due to other factors like flawed candidates or ties to Trump is a matter of debate. Indeed, a Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, the Republican from Kentucky, said last month that while abortion may have galvanized some supporters for Democrats, the GOP's main problem was candidate quality. Throughout the midterm campaign, Republican candidates leaned on the threefold strategy of focusing on rising inflation, crime, and the flow of migrants over the southern border. As the smoke has cleared in months since the midterms, more Republicans, including the Republican National Committee Chair Ronna McDaniel, argued that candidates could have mirrored their Democratic opponents by taking a stronger approach on the issue. Conservatives lay blame on the GOP's leadership on Capitol Hill, arguing that they had set the tone for what they say is the party's less than aggressive strategy on abortion. When I talk about leadership, I'm talking about the RNC, Schilling said. I'm more talking about McConnell and a lot of these House leaders who refuse to have any votes that put Democrats on the defense. McConnell has thrown cold water on the idea of a national abortion ban, arguing that the issue should be dealt with at the state level. Anti-abortion advocates have strongly pushed back against that notion. Don't say it's just up to the states now, said Marilyn Musgrave, Vice President of Government Affairs at the Susan B. Anthony Pro-Life America. No, it's up to the people and their elected representatives, and that includes federally. Our candidates need to point out how extreme the other side is, she added. Many anti-abortion proponents say their best case scenario would be a national 15-week ban on the procedure. The winning strategy is endorsing an aggressive 15-week bill with exceptions, Schilling said. Still, Republicans say the party needs to find its footing on the issue ahead of the 2023 off-year elections and the presidential election in 2024, where the pro-life party, we are the pro-life party. We've been the pro-life party, said the GOP strategist. How do you not know how to talk about it when we've been running on it for decades? That's a good question. That is a good question, and I think I can come up with a fairly decent answer. And that is, there are a lot of people, not just in the GOP, but in America, in the way that we debate about most issues, that they know what they believe, but they don't know why they believe it. I think we need to get back to first principles thinking, where we actually start to wrestle with issues no matter what the topic, and we decide why we believe what we believe. What actually tends to happen is there is just a tribalism factor in the echo chamber of our discourse in life. And we sign up for this team. This team says they believe A. We start to say A. We do not tend to question or to say, why do we believe A? Have we tested A against B and C? Can we defend this position? Is this a moral question or is this a sociological question? What's the data on this? Has it been tested anywhere else? When it was tested in this state, what happened? When it was tested in this country, what happened? That is the way you have to shape these arguments. And a lot of times, that is not what happened. People leaned on platitudes versus policy, and talking points versus actually having any real deep thoughts about these difficult questions. So you're going to have to get some genuine people who have policy and not platitudes. And then that's how we'll fix this issue. If people ran on it for years in the hopes that they would never have to take it up, and the Supreme Court basically came in and said, you know what, you're going to have to stand on something. So I'm more than willing and ready to continue to have this conversation, because it is a deep and important one. Now, sticking with the Supreme Court for a moment, the Supreme Court is actually set to have a very busy winter. The Supreme Court returned on Monday to hear its first oral arguments in 2023, considering cases that could impact attorney-client privilege, labor laws, and foreign nations' legal immunity. The justices will hear 7 cases in the 2-week sitting, though none involve major Biden administration policies, student loan debt, and Title 42 will get their days in court later in the term.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
It goes without saying that this show does not happen without listener support. Support the Jerome McClain Show by going to www.patreon.com and getting a membership for $3. Or you can go to buzzsprouts.com/The Jerome McClain Show and hit the subscribe button and join there. Many ways to donate to the show. Independent media that won't reinforce tribalism. We have one planet. Nobody is leaving, so let us reason together. www.patreon.com/The Jerome McClain Show, or go to Buzzsprouts and to The Jerome McClain Show and subscribe. So here are just a few cases slated for oral arguments this month. In re-grand jury, the court will kick off the year with a case whose background is shrouded in mystery. The case arose when a tax law firm declined to produce certain documents demanded by a grand jury subpoena issued during a criminal tax investigation until the firm's unnamed client. Justices will consider whether the firm can withhold so-called dual purposes communication, meaning those interviewed with legal and non-legal advice, after lowering appellate court split on whether legal advice must be the primary or a significant purpose for attorney-client privilege to apply. The firm, supported by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and some attorney groups, argues that the more stringent threshold creates a unpredictable a test for tax firms and in-house legal counsels that regularly intervene legally business guidance, effectively eroding the privilege. The federal government contends that following their argument would sweepingly shield documents about accounting and business development without a compelling justification. So then there will be Ohio Adjacent General's Department versus Federal Labor Relations Authority. So on Monday, justices considered if a 1978 law regulating the labor practice of federal agencies extended to Ohio's National Guard technicians. The National Guard is organized by individual states, but the federal government can also activate it for particular missions, setting up a legal battle when Ohio's National Guard in 2016 attempted to end a collective bargaining agreement with its civilian technicians. The Technicians Union, in a complaint with the Federal Labor Relations Authority, the FLRA, which Congress created to oversee labor relations for executive agencies' employees, alleged that the Guard didn't negotiate in good faith. The FLRA sided with the union, but the Ohio National Guard argues that the technicians are not federal executive agency employees, so the FLRA never had the authority. Another case will be Glacier Northwest Inc. versus International Brotherhood of Teamsters. In late 2017, Ready Mix Concrete Company Glacier Northwest filed a lawsuit in Washington state against its employees' union, seeking damages for concrete purportedly destroyed because the workers went on strike after the fleet was already loaded. The justices on Tuesday were set to consider whether the federal labor laws prevent the lawsuit at all before the National Labor Relations Board determines if the union engaged in protected activity. Glacier Northwest, describing the union's timing as sabotage, argues that circumstances met an expectation and an exception for cases to move forward outlined in the court's 1959 San Diego Building Trades versus Garmin decision. Teamsters argued that the exception doesn't apply and that the strike was protected activity. Another case is the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico versus the Central del Poro de Melceno Investigation, Inc. The justice will hear arguments about whether a financial oversight board Congress established to manage Puerto Rico's debt crisis has immunity from a public records lawsuit. States receive sovereign immunity from certain lawsuits, but the group seeking the records argues that the rule doesn't apply because Puerto Rico is a territory. Even if it did, the group contends the law establishing the board clearly states that the entity does not enjoin immunity in federal courts. The board contents are that the position are they that the arguing that the statute does not provide clear and unmistakable language revoking its sovereign immunity. Interesting. So then you'll have Santos Zachariah via Garland, and that is the justice will hear their first immigration case of the calendar year of January 17th when they dive into a requirement that migrants exhaust all administration remedies available before appealing their immigration decision in the courts. The case involves Leo Santos Zachariah, who said she fled Guatemala after being raped and receiving death threats because she is transgender. Santos Zachariah elevated her immigration ruling to the federal appeals court, but the court held that she had failed the exhaustion requirement by not filing a motion asking for the Board of Immigration Appeals to reconsider an earlier decision. Santos Zachariah argued she did not need to file the motion to satisfy the requirement, and that the requirement regardless does not bar the court's jurisdiction. The federal government disputes her interpretation. Another case will be Turkey Hawk Bensi Asa versus United States. The justices on January 17 were set to hear a challenge to the indictment of Halk Bank, a bank almost entirely owned by Turkey's government, alleging it circumvented U.S. sanctions on Iranian funds. The bank denies the allegations, but rather than considering the merits, it instead is urging the justice to deem the indictment unlawful based on historical factors and the Foreign Sovereignty Immunities Act, which in 1976 established when a foreign nation is immune from a U.S. lawsuit. The federal government argues that the law does not apply to criminal cases, and even if it did, the case would fall under an exception, allowing suits arising from foreign governments' commercial activity. Perez versus Struggers Public Schools. The court's final case this month, set for January 18, arose after a deaf student, Miguel Lane Perez, and his parents settled with Struggers Public School in 2018 over Perez's claims that he was denied a qualified sign language interpreter for 12 years. They settled those claims under the Federal Individuals with Disability Education Act, the IDEA, but the Supreme Court will consider the validity of Perez's subsequent lawsuit under the Americans Disabilities Act, the ADA. A lower appeals court ruled that since Perez settled the earlier claim, he didn't exhaust the process, so the federal law bars him from bringing a similar case under the ADA. The school's district asked the justice to uphold that decision, but Perez contends that the settlement qualifies as a exhaustion. Perez further argues that exhausting the IDEA was never required to begin with because his new lawsuit seeks a remedy to the earlier claim that it could not provide. The school's district argued that the remedy sought doesn't change the requirement. So the Supreme Court will be very, very busy in this beginning in the term. And look, I watched this, I'm on this thing called Judicial Watch. And so I'm always kind of paying attention to what's going on in the courts. Don't talk about it a lot. A lot of it is, I'll just say, just obscure business law that I don't know if people will find interesting. I find it interesting enough, but not always interesting enough to be able to thoroughly explain. But because these are going to be some very contentious decisions, and I think the public it needs to be aware of them, and I think I can thoroughly explain a few of them. I'm going to be paying attention to them so you don't have to. But of course, that is said with the caveat of don't always take my word for it. Go out and do some of the research yourself. So let's get to some of the political news of the day, of the week, I should say. Let's get to some campaign news. Let me go to my home state. Let's go to my beautiful, beautiful home state, the lovely state, sunshine state of Florida. DeSantis is GOP's early frontrunner, and that could be a problem. Now, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is early frontrunner in the 2024 GOP presidential primary, but lawmakers and strategists warn this can sometimes be the death knell for a candidate, pointing to other early presidential frontrunners who flamed out despite high expectations. Experts say there are a variety of lessons for DeSantis to learn from those early frontrunners who failed to live up to potential, such as former Florida Governor Jeb Bush, who was too cautious and suffered from a perceived lack of energy in 2016, or former Vermont Governor Howard Dean, the Democrat who got bogged down in a mudslinging match in Iowa. Some pundits are warning DeSantis could peak too soon, as former Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker did before the 2016 Republican presidential primary. Or they warn he could make the mistakes of waiting until the Florida primary to fully deploy his efforts and resources, former New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani did in 2008's GOP primary, at which point Giuliani fell too far behind his rivals to catch up. People flame out. It's too early to know who's actually going to be in contention, but he certainly had a successful election, and he's strong, a candidate from a big, important state, so you can't discount him, said Senator John Cornyn, the Republican of Texas, said of DeSantis, who won re-election in November with a 59% of the vote. Many Republicans see DeSantis as their best shot to win the 2024 presidential election, but Cornyn quipped that being early to the frontrunner means you're the main spear catcher, as the rivals train their hostile fire at the leader of the pack. Ford O'Connell, a Republican strategist, said that being the frontrunner was the death knell to people like Jeb Bush. He said he thinks that political circumstances surrounding DeSantis are different compared to Bush, but added, right now in this political environment, nothing would surprise me. David Pelagoulas, the director of the Political Research Center at Suffolk University, who conducted a poll last month showing that 61% of the GOP and the GOP-leaning voters prefer DeSantis over the former President Trump, said the Florida governor faces an array of potential pitfalls if he runs for president. The second-tier candidates have an incentive to make their number one target DeSantis because they know the alternate to Trump candidate in the Republican primary is the better and stronger choice in the general election, he said. He said early presidential frontrunners in the past elections have made the mistake of sitting on their lead in the polls and not competing aggressively enough in the run-up to the Iowa caucus and the New Hampshire primary, likening it to the football team that plays a prevent defense and in the final minutes of the game to protect its lead against the big plays, but winds up giving its opponent a too soft of a cushion. What happens is candidates take a defensive posture. It's like if you're leading in a football game, your strategy is vastly different than if you are trailing, he said, adding that the team that is playing from behind will be more aggressive, creative, and scrappy. Pollsters for people who are on the front runners are advising accordingly, saying you don't need to engage, you don't need to respond, you don't need to give any oxygen to the second-tier candidate. He said, warning that over time the strategy can let an opponent build up too much momentum. Strategists say DeSantis could learn from various early frontrunners who flamed out in the early past. Florida Governor Jeb Bush in 2015 through 2016, Bush announced in July of 2015 that he had raised more than $114 million for his campaign and affiliated a super PAC for more than any of his Republican presidential rivals. An NBC Wall Street Journal poll from that summer of 2015 showed him at the front of the pack with 22% support among GOP primary voters, followed by Walker at 17% and Florida Senator Marco Rubio at 14%. Trump had the backing of a mega one percenter of the Republican primary voters polled him, tying him at the time with Senator Lindsey Graham. But however went on to win only 2.8% of the vote in Iowa caucus, 11% of the vote in New Hampshire primary, and 7.8% of the vote in South Carolina primary. One of the low points of the campaign came in New Hampshire, where he implored a sleepy audience to please clap. Another came when Trump mocked him in a debate for steadily losing public support and getting positioned further and further away from the center of the debate stage. I think he was cautious. I think he was being overly defensive and cautious. Pelologos said Bush, his skill set and the age of his advisors was much more seasoned, and discounted the potential for someone else to come in and steal the nomination away from him, which is obviously exactly what happened. Of course, now we go to Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker, and his was in 2015. And Doug Sneenan, a political consultant who advised the former President Clinton, a former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg's 2020 presidential campaign, warned in an op-ed for The Hill last month that DeSantis needs to be wary of the peril of peaking too soon. Schoon wrote that DeSantis needs to worry about a worsening of favorability crisis in the Florida driven by rising property insurance and energy costs, and like Walker was in 2016, in untested on the national stage. Walker led the Republican pack of presidential hopefuls in Iowa in January of 2015, according to the Des Moines Register and Bloomberg Politics poll. A Manamith University poll in July 2015 showed him still leading the field in Iowa with 22% support. Trump was running in second place with 13% support in the same poll, but Walker would end up dropping out of the race only a few months later after he failed to show any charisma in Arpaisa in two debates and got tagged with the reputation of being boring. That word I was trying to say was pizzazz. Walker also wound up committing a few painful gaffes, such as when he refused to talk about his views on evolution during a trip to London, or when he says whether he thought the President Obama was a Christian. O'Connell recalls Scott walked into a big round of donors and they were like, the man just does not have the right temperament. He said big donors are looking for chops and also looking for personality. New York Mayor Rudy Giuliani in 2016 to 2008, a Gallup poll in February of 2007 showed Giuliani leading the Republican field with 40% support among Republicans and Republican-leaning voters, easily outdistancing then Senator John McCain of Arizona, who had the support of 24% of Republican voters. Giuliani was still the national frontrunner in November of 2007, but he adopted an unorthodox and ultimately unsuccessful strategy of keeping his powder dry until the Florida primary, where he hoped to rack up enough delegates to leap ahead of his rivals. The former New York politician was worried his abortion stance would be a liability with the conservative voters who had made only modest efforts to perform well in those early states. By the time Florida held its primary on January 29, 2008, Giuliani was no longer seen as a frontrunner or even all that competitive. He finished in a distant third place with 14.7% of the vote, well behind McCain and former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney. When you look at who actually wins 6 out of the last 7 presidents were people who couldn't win, said Republican strategist Chip Saltzman. We always have these inevitable conversations about inevitable frontrunners a year or two out. It's just what we do when you look at very few people who are ahead at the very beginning of the race actually run the tables. Saltzman, who managed Arkansas's Governor Mike Huckabee's 2008 Republican presidential campaign, said Giuliani didn't go all out in the early states because he was pro-choice and didn't think he could get through Iowa and South Carolina being the pro-choice candidate. He said Giuliani's staff were spending all the time in Florida in September, October, November, and December and were struggling and slugging it out in the frozen tundra of Iowa. Vermont Governor Howard Dean, of course, in 2003 and 2004. This was actually when I first started paying attention to politics. I was getting ready to graduate. But anyway, probably the most memorable meltdown of a presidential frontrunner was the implosion of Dean's campaign in 2004, the Iowa caucus. Encapsulated by the infamous Dean scream after he finished in a disappointing third. That was when he did that yaw thing. It was pretty funny. But anyway, Dean was dominating the Democratic field only a few weeks before the Iowa caucus with 23% of support among registered voters nationwide, according to CBS News poll conducted in that mid-December of 2003. He was well ahead of General Wesley Clark and Senator Joe Lieberman, who tied for second place with 10% support. Missouri Rep. Richard Gerhardt and Senator John Kerry and John Edwards trailed in single digits with 6%, 4%, and 2% respectively. Dean still had a comfortable lead in the early January of 2004, 2 weeks before the Iowa contest, with 24% support among registered Democrats nationwide, while Clark had 20% support and Kerry had 11% support. But Dean got bogged down in a nasty and negative ad war with Gebhardt, who he viewed as his toughest competitor in Iowa, and both candidates wound up alienating and each other and creating a pathway for Kerry to win the caucus and Edwards to finish in second. They were really going all in on TV against one another, and they just came right up in the middle and had so much momentum, and Edwards followed in the wake, said Democratic strategist Tad Devine, who was a senior advisor to Kerry campaign. By the time we got to the caucus night, Dean and Gebhardt were gone. He said Gebhardt got out of the race, and Dean gave a speech that essentially ended his candidacy. Now, let me go ahead and put my lot into this debate. And all the caveats being given that I normally don't even do what we call political predictions. I do not see how or what Ron DeSantis does against a Donald Trump-like person on the debate stage. And I will keep going back to what I said in previous shows. I'm not interested in what happens in campaign commercials. I'm not interested in what the mainstream media says. I'm not interested in what the polls say. The mainstream media is normally wrong because they are a bunch of millionaires carrying the water for billionaires and multinational corporations. The polls are normally wrong because polls, a lot of people lie to the pollsters, or the pollsters ask questions in specific ways to get the questions answered in the way they would like them to be answered. But when the voters actually show up, they pick something very different. And what I am still waiting to see and still waiting to have my question answered is what makes Ron DeSantis any different than Chris Christie and the way he was positioned in 2016. What makes Ron DeSantis any different than a Rand Paul and how he was positioned in 2016? What makes Ron DeSantis any different than any of the 15, 16, 17 people that Donald Trump ran against that he beat? When I see Ron DeSantis, all I see is a standard Republican. He is very good at messaging and staying on point. Yeah, well, so is mostly any politician. You go to the left, that's actually what you were supposed to hate about politicians. the packaged, processed, no personality of Hillary Clinton was supposed to be the most detestable thing in politics. So you have somebody who is Trump light, and you put Trump on the ballot. And my general thought process is that's just not what people do. If you get whiskey, and if I come to you and I say, well, I got something that's just like whiskey light, most people roll their eyes and they just get the whiskey. It happens in primary after primary. The most extreme person in the primary always comes out on top in Republican primaries, and not the most moderate. The most extreme candidate wins. Not only that, in general elections, when I have seen where Democrats try to run themselves as Republican light, the Republican wins. Because Republicans aren't interested in Republican light. They want the Republican. They're not interested in a blue dog Democrat. They are interested in Republican policies. So I am still unconvinced that Ron DeSantis is not high on his own supply. I am not convinced that what you are actually seeing is that people like Rupert Murdoch, who is the owner of these organizations that ends up owning Fox News. I think it's called News Corp. He is tired of Donald Trump, and that the Mercers are tired of Donald Trump. So all the rich donors, but Donald Trump still has 32% of a base. 32% that no matter what happened, they have not moved. Even when he questionably tried to seemingly get his own vice president hanged, they turned against the vice president and stuck with Donald Trump. I don't even know why Donald Trump is upset or why he's targeting DeSantis. If it was me, I would just bow out, let Donald Trump get a run in 2024, probably lose.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Rising anti-Semitism. New generations redefining how they connect with Jewish traditions. Changing dynamics among Jews around the globe. Take a deep dive into these topics and more on Mosaic, Exploring Jewish Issues, the podcast brought to you by the Jewish Federation of Palm Beach County. Hear from the thought leaders, politicians, scholars, and artists at the forefront of Jewish life today. Subscribe to Mosaic, Exploring Jewish Issues, wherever you listen to podcasts.
And I would have myself set to run in the next election. And I run for president in 2028, and I get it, and I seemed like I was the heir apparent, but I was also reasonable, and I let the former president get his shot. Or like I said in the last show, well, it doesn't actually matter, because even if Donald Trump ran and won, by the way the laws are set up, he only gets to have one more term, which is 4 years. So then DeSantis steps in and gets the mantle. But I think that what we're actually seeing is a bait and switch. Is the corporate Republicans the have decided that they are tired of Donald Trump, and they have casted their ballot with DeSantis. And so now, if you look at a lot of those papers that used to be all for Trump, now they're posting cartoons of him as Humpty Dumpty. Even Candace Owens came out and said negative things about him. Oh, he was rude to me and all this type of stuff. Kanye West is crazily thinking he's going to run against Donald Trump again, and bringing out old Nick Fuentes and all this stuff. That is like almost like an operation going on, where it's like, no. Those people who control the media elites on the right have said, we're not going to do the Trump thing again. So they're doing everything they can to make sure that he seems unappealing. I'm not sure if the hard liners are going to go with that. I'm not sure about it. So I'll be watching the DeSantis thing like everybody else, but I am not convinced yet that it's gonna happen. I'm not convinced yet it's gonna happen. Sticking to the Grand Old Party for a moment, the GOP is actually in a battle with itself over the possibility of something that would have not been heard of years ago. So the GOP is battling itself over the possibility of cuts to the Defense Department. So House Republicans are battling over the reductions to defense spendings, with some of the GOP downplaying the potential for Pentagon cuts, and Democrats actually warning a small group of conservatives could lead to big budgetary cuts. Speaker Kevin McCarthy, as part of his concessions to Republicans opposed to his speakership, agreed to put a limit on new discretionary spending. The limit would cap all discretionary spending at fiscal 2022 levels if agreed to as part of a House budget. Now, the 2022 defense budget was $780 billion compared to $850 billion budget for fiscal 2023. As a result, an agreement could cut $70 billion for defense spending based on those figures. Rep. Adam Smith, the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee in previous Congress, said the cuts were a real possibility given the narrow GOP majority and the power of a small band of conservatives. Quote, what we saw in the speakership fight was that a relatively small number of Republicans are willing to hold the process hostage out of the desire to make dramatic cuts in the budget, Smith told The Hill. So regardless of what McCarthy did or did not promise, that same group of people can do the same thing on the budget, on the appropriations bill, on the defense bill. End quote. Now, fears that the defense budget could be cut were their started reason Rep. Tony Gonzalez, rep from Texas, gave voting no on the House rules package on Monday. Gonzalez had warned of his potential vote during an interview Sunday with CBS Morgan Brennan, in which he said the potential defense cuts were a horrible idea. When you have aggressive Russians in Ukraine, you got a growing threat of China in the Pacific. How am I going to look at our allies in the eye and say, I need you to increase the defense budget, but yet America is going to decrease ours, he said. Gonzalez was the sole GOP vote against the House rules package that passed along party lines on Monday. It's possible there will be no cuts into defense after the Pentagon has seen its budget rise steadily in recent years. A majority of House Republicans are not likely to back any significant cuts to the defense budget, which has typically been a recipient of broad bipartisan support. And the spokesperson for Rep. Chip Roy, the Republican of Texas, who was among the McCarthy holdouts last week, called the claim to cutting the defense budget garbage. The spokesman also pointed to a Twitter thread from Roy's press office that discounted the idea of defense cuts. In a thread, Roy's press office said the discretionary cap would mean cutting $135 billion from fiscal 2023 levels overall and not from defense. The thread said that the cuts could mostly come from federal agencies, and Roy said the defense spending cuts were never mentioned during private talks. In fact, there was a broad agreement that spending cuts could focus on non-defense discretionary spending. The thread reads, this means cutting funding for the woke and weaponized bureaucrats that receives massive increases under the $1.7 trillion omnibus. Now, the memo tripped Roy seized his moment. However, the White House Democrats in the House and the Senate would be opposed to just cutting domestic discretionary spending alone. That could lead to cuts to defense and non-defense spending, or no cuts, or it could lead to an intense fight and a government shutdown. The Defense Department declined to comment on the story. Some lawmakers in both parties have raised questions about whether the skyrocketing Pentagon budget, while other Republicans and Democrat Party voices have offered support for more defense spendings. And Ukraine is expecting a long war with Russia, while Taiwan is under increased threat from China. The Pentagon has also said it needs to keep growing to counter the rise of China's military, which is on pace to quadruple its nuclear arsenal in the next 13 years. White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan expressed little concern for the foreseeable future in the terms of funding for Ukraine, noting that $45 billion for Ukraine that was included in the $1.7 trillion omnibus funding bill last year. I do not see that money getting away from us. He said in a press gaggle on Monday, it is there. It's rock solid through nearly of all 2023. The National Defense Authorization Act passed last year also includes $10 billion for Taiwan spread out for 5 years. Clashes over the defense budget likely foreshadows a longer battle on defense spending over the next 2 years. Now, before the GOP narrowly took over the House in November midterm election, McCarthy had promised there would be no blank check for Ukraine. Far-right Republican lawmakers have also decried the billions of dollars in the U.S. security assistance flowing to Ukraine without a proper audit of where the money is going. Some Republicans have signaled that there could be cuts in the defense departments to relate to woke practices, a growing cry for the GOP over what they say are extreme progressive policies in the military. Rep. Jim Jordan told Fox News on Sunday that everything has to be on the table for budget cuts. Maybe focus on getting rid of all the woke policies in our military, the lawmaker said. House Majority Whip Tom Emmer also said on Fox and Friends that any cuts would not impact the Defense Department except for what it called waste. Republicans will not impact defense spending aside from efficiencies and waste, Emmer said on Monday. It's the domestic spending we're going to go after. Smith said the House Armed Service Committee is united behind maintaining defense spending and will continue to do its work this year. The Democrats explained he was mostly concerned about Republican detractors shutting down the government over budget talks. It's really the chaos factor driven by a small number of Republicans who think the federal government is irrelevant. He said what 80 to 90% of the conference wants may not be enough to overcome the chaos. Whenever it comes to this sort of thing, the key is to always remember what they ran on and what you got. Always hold these politicians accountable. I don't think that it's actually rare for 60% of the country to want something and them not getting it. So I also don't see it as an anomaly when 90% of the Congress wants something and it doesn't happen. We can go look at the previous Congress and what happened when the government was divided. Look at what they voted on, what the American people wanted versus what they got, and we can use that as a precursor and a kind of a view of what more than likely is going to happen this time. I labor under the assumption that it's going to be the investigative Congress, just like it was in the last one, where there's a lot of investigations about stuff that it matters a lot to people inside of the Beltway, but it doesn't matter a lot to the everyday American person, the American voter. So Biden has given the Grand Old Party a massive gift with these documents. And so I assume that there's going to be investigation after investigation on the documents. And think about the what happened with the Benghazi hearings. I imagine it's going to be a lot of that. And whether that helps with inflation is yet to be seen. Whether that helps with the rising gas prices, yet to be seen. Whether that helps with energy, yet to be seen. We'll just have to see if that helps anybody on the material level on every day. But I do know for a fact that it will help to gin up support, and it repeats a certain narrative of corruption. I'm expecting, and it's going to be ballsy to do, but I'm expecting to see some Hunter Biden investigation stuff. There was a report that Hunter had changed his lawyers or had lawyered up, which leads me to believe that he also thinks that there's going to be some type of investigation. And that is the type of stuff that you can expect to see up until 2024. And so that's what we have to look forward to. At any rate, buckle up. We are in campaign season now. And I got another show coming up. I got to talk about the elections that happened in Virginia. Some warnings that it may mean, even though it was mixed. There are people that are now saying that the Youngkin style of politics has to be gone for the GOP because there was a lot of unexpected losses in Virginia. We'll get to that on the next episode as well. So, in our blast from the intellectual past, today we're going to go back in the time machine of 3 years ago and visit some life-changing advice about from neuroscientist Sam Harris on how to control your thoughts.
Most of what people care about can be thought of as a skill. Right? I mean, well-being is a skill. Not suffering unnecessarily is a skill. Regulating, noticing your emotional life and regulating negative emotion is a skill. The moment you begin practicing mindfulness, which is just learning to pay close attention to the nature of your experience, you're not adding anything to your experience. You're just noticing what it's like to be you moment to moment, but in a way that is not reactive. You're not grasping at what's pleasant or pushing what's unpleasant away. You're just, to make this concrete, I mean, let's say you have a fear of public speaking, right? So you're about to go out on stage and you feel anxiety. The default state of someone who doesn't want to have that experience is one to, in advance worry about that experience. I mean, the anxiety is kindled just by the mere thought of what you have to do. Then once you feel the butterflies, you are at war with them, right? Your mind contracts around it. Like I see people do this all the time. They're relaxed. I'm unhappy. When am I? And you're talking to yourself. You're not noticing it because the thoughts just come up from behind you as fast as they can, and they seem to be you, right? You're identified with each thought that emerges in consciousness. And most people live their lives as though there's no alternative. We're not given a rule book for how to operate a human mind, right? And there's no place in a normal education where it's even indicated that there's an alternative here. And so we kind of stumble out into adulthood, more or less assuming that we'll always have the minds we have, and that really there's, the only thing we can do to really upgrade our firmware is to just add new content. We can read books, we can develop interests, but there's nothing at the sort of root level of our emotional and cognitive life that can change. And so mindfulness is a way of kind of dropping a little bit lower and realizing, so in this case, if you're feeling anxiety, there's actually a place from which you can just feel it, right? And be actually indifferent to it or anything else you could be feeling. I mean, just notice that there's even an unpleasant sensation. I mean, first you can notice that anxiety isn't even that unpleasant. I mean, it's so close to excitement in its actual physiology that really the difference between excitement and anxiety is more or less just the framing. It's just the story you're telling yourself. If you felt these tingles and this slightly adrenalized response right before you're about to go on a roller coaster, that's part of why you're going on the roller coaster. You like that experience, right? But the fact that you feel that way when you're about to have an interview or you're about to walk out on stage, that's intolerable, right? So just dropping back and realizing the power of the framing is again, this is a skill that is a fairly esoteric one, but now many people are learning it. The secret's out, and it has immense utility because then you can realize that the half-life of negative emotions is incredibly short. I mean, one, you can actually be psychologically free even in their presence, right? Your freedom and your well-being isn't even predicated on getting rid of the physiology, right? Like it can still be there, but if you're not continually thinking about all the reasons why you should be anxious, the physiology dissipates very, very quickly. And that's true for anger, it's true for anything that is classically negative. Now, if we're talking about a clinical depression, it's useful to say that there's a physiology to this that can be driven from below in a way that's not narrowly responsive to their thinking, right? So it'll tend to produce depressive thoughts, and the depressive thoughts will tend to feed back on the state. And everything else that is good to do that people sort of lose their commitment to doing at the worst possible time should be done. I mean, you have to sort of get behind yourself and push to exercise and to socialize and to do things that you may not want to do because those are good for you and help can break you out of it. But the normal range of psychological suffering not clinical depression, but just feeling like, life sucks and you're a failure and there's nothing, it's like you're stuck. That is a story of telling yourself a story. You're thinking, and you can either become more and more mindful of that and interrupt that more and more, and it should be you can reframe this continually and tell yourself a better story. But you can actually just engineer, you can change the code that you're running moment to moment. And I mean, just a very simple one, which I use, and I actually recently recorded this in a lesson on the app. Just gratitude, just thinking. This is actually, this particular maneuver is, I believe, comes from Stoic philosophy. I didn't actually get it from Stoic philosophy, but this sort of use of negative imagination, where you think of all of the bad things that haven't happened to you. Right? So if you're just, if you're stuck in traffic, driving to the job that you don't like, and you're frustrated, you can think of all the things that could happen to you, right? That haven't. And if any one of them happened to you, you would consider your prayers answered if you could just be returned to this moment, right? Like, you haven't been diagnosed with cancer, right? You've got 2 young kids, say, you want to live to see them grow up, and you could be the guy who today is going to find out you've got 2 months to live, right? And then the next 2 months is spent just unwinding your worldly affairs, right? You're not that guy, right? That hasn't happened to you yet. That's just more thinking, but it can have a profound effect. You can reframe your experience in a way that doesn't actually change anything material about your circumstance, and it can let the light in. The generic situation we want to find ourselves in more and more is to effortlessly cooperate with creative and happy strangers, right? I mean, there's 7 billion of us. We need institutions and laws and norms and ways of thinking that take the friction out of pleasurable and non-paranoid interaction with strangers. I mean, it's not just about having 5 or so close friends who have your back, right? I mean, clearly we're all on the same team on some basic level, and if we can't figure out how to build a civilization where everyone thrives to some degree, we'll have the world we currently have until it becomes unsustainable. Because we're in a situation now where I think it's reasonable to worry that our default state of partisanship and tribalism and rational fear of the incompatible aims of other groups and other people is unsustainable in the presence of more and more destructive technology. I think we have to get our act together psychologically and socially in a way that we haven't yet. It may be useful to have a slightly delusional, self-serving bias, right? To think you're coming off better than you are. It may give you more enthusiasm for your life and more confidence, but anything that's too out of register is just delusion, right? And other people notice, and other people treat you like somebody who's just not tracking in a reality. And so I think we want our beliefs to be true in some basic sense. And therefore, we want to be open to new evidence and better arguments perpetually, right? Because if you close yourself off, if you say, listen, I'm done thinking about reality, and I know what's true, then again, when more data comes in, when something surprising, when one of your intuitions proves to be faulty, if you can't error correct, again, you're just going to fall out of alignment with what's going on in the world and what other people think is true as well. So really the only mechanism we have to do that is human conversation. We have to be open to having other people point out errors in our thinking, and in the conversation we have with ourselves, we have to do likewise. Many of the things that people think they want out of life, the ways they're keeping score about how good their lives are or aren't, they're not seen as this experience as being delivered to them either based on the skills they have or the skills they've never thought to acquire.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Of course, if you want to support the show, you can do so by going to www.patreon.com and getting a membership for as little as $3 a month. Again, that's www.patreon.com/The Darrell McClain Show. The Darrell McClain Show is fully listener-supported, independent media that won't lead you to tribalism. Get a membership and support independent media at www.patreon.com/The Darrell McClain Show.